Hey there, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tercek, and this week I'm flying solo because Brett King is out there barnstorming around the world, as he always is, bringing the vision and ideas of the future to audiences around the world. That's kind of our mission here. We want to help more people think about the future, and Brett is tireless in his efforts to do so. This week, I've been thinking all about emergencies. I've been thinking about some of the strange possibilities that may lie in the future. It's no coincidence, it's no happy accident that I'm thinking about that. We have had a week of strange announcements from the administration in the United States. The new president is starting to appoint his cabinet. And in almost every case, the people he's appointing are people who stand for and vigorously oppose the policies and the organizations that they're going to be leading. So he's actually putting together not a cabinet, not a team of rivals, as we've heard in the past about other presidents, but it's a team of loyalists who collectively are going to be a kind of wrecking ball. And that brought to mind some of the past, some of the moments from the past. For me, I've been thinking about how ill-prepared President Trump was the last time he was in office and how that led to catastrophes in the United States and elsewhere in the world. So planning matters. Foresight matters. And it makes a very important difference who you select to do the planning and forecasting. And I thought in the context of that, it would be helpful for our audience to hear from someone who is a deep expert in the subject of foresight and planning and strategy. Our guest today is Donna Dupont. She's the founder and chief strategist of foresight and design at Purple Compass, which is an advisory based in Canada. And she's also a principal at the School of International Futures. And Donna focuses on public safety and emergency preparedness and emergency response. And so I guess I can do no better service to our listeners than to find someone who's an expert in these subjects, because I think we're all going to need to develop some expertise in emergency management in just a couple months when this clown car of cabinet starts to take office. Well, welcome to the Futurist, Donna. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining our show.
Thank you for the invitation, Rob.
So I thought what we might do to begin with is learn a little bit more about you. So you work at Purple Compass. You actually started Purple Compass. Tell me about the mission of that organization.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I started Purple Compass 6 years ago, actually seven now, just turned seven. And originally the mission was to support those that were working in public or private sector who wanted to build futures thinking within their organization.
Hmm.
And so that's where it started. And then in the last 7 years, I've had an opportunity to work on projects all over the world, supporting organizations and collaborating with a lot of different agencies, supporting, a lot of work in mostly defense and security, but that's been broadening out in terms of security, meaning health security and different climate security, emergency management, and even international development. So all of these agencies are really trying to cultivate this futures mindset. And so I've been working on a variety of projects around the world to help them build that internal capacity and capability.
And you've done that for provincial governments in Canada and the national government in Canada, but you've also worked with, I know, for instance, European agencies as well. Is that right?
I have,
Yeah.
yes. I have. So I definitely have partnered with the School of International Futures. It was more being part of their network where
Mhm.
I acted as a principal on a variety of projects for them to help bring in the force. But because of my background in security, it allowed me to explore those really complex topics within those projects.
And some of the things you've talked about, you've got expertise in public health. I would imagine that extends to pandemics and infectious disease because that's a big focus for public health. But you've also worked with in the UK, you've worked on the future of policing, and you've also done work with mines, like mining. Is that right?
Yes, yes, there's a lot there. So definitely I have a background in provincial government. I used to work as a public servant. And so, yes, I have a very strong health background, both clinically in the field and then in government and in public health, specifically in emergency management, responding to a variety of emergencies like wildfires, floods, but also health-related emergencies like infectious disease outbreaks and pandemics. That's been a previous But yes, now within foresight and design and the work I've been doing the last 7 years, it's been much more broader in terms of working with organizations at the national and international level and really helping with some of these big challenges, complex global challenges for organizations. And so it's a very different perspective in seeing what's happening at that level.
In the international level, you're talking about moving really big machinery. Like these are big organizations and they represent huge populations. How
Yes.
difficult is it to get consensus? Is that a big part of your job to build consensus on what to do?
So it's a process. So when you are working with organizations that want to explore futures or use futures in their, in the work that they do, it's a process of understanding the landscape, right? And it's a process of engaging different people. So understanding the landscape means taking a look at some of the information you have. What do we know in terms of the evidence in the system and working with experts to say, okay, what's changing in the system? And then starting to then build some sort of have sense making around what's happening in the system
Hmm.
and then engaging other people broadly in terms of having strategic conversations around specific points in the system where there's a potential for things to escalate, where we're seeing a lot of challenges, where there's pressures for the organization. Those are opportunities to go much deeper and then
Okay,
to
let
bring
me
in
ask you a
different.
little bit about that. So one of the things you're trying to do, and what I'm hearing you say, is you're trying to solicit opinions and perspectives from many different, let's say, stakeholders, people who have an opinion. Um, and yet, I would imagine in a big complex organization, there are differing opinions, sometimes probably clashing opinions about what to do or what the nature of the problem is.
That's
How
right.
do you avoid an opinion war? How do you avoid a situation where you have two people who have equal authority or equal expertise who fundamentally disagree about what the issue is or what the problem they're facing might be or what the solution might be? How do you manage that as an outside facilitator?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's typically in the setup of whatever type of workshop that we are engaging in. And it's about setting some ground rules around how we communicate in that particular workshop, because you will have people with different perspectives and very strong perspectives,
Mhm.
but you want to create a psychologically safe space to have these conversations and to really look at the tension points around that and have dialogue about, okay, if it's not so much which one is right, but sometimes you have to transcend a lot of these contradictions or different opinions. And so it's creating a safe space for that type of dialogue to have those kind of conversations and to see what new insights you can generate around what it means for the future. And that's part of the work. It's not predicting the future. As a person who works in the professional foresight and future space, I don't predict the future. What we do is in this space is we understand uncertainty and change, and we work with it in a very focused and intentional way to
Mhm.
advance dialogue, right? And then from that dialogue, we have new insights. And it's mining
Sure.
those new insights that can shape all kinds of new decisions for the future.
Sure, I get that. And that's of course that's the goal is to get to the insights. But we live in a world where the leaders of organizations are often people who are rewarded in their career and get career advancement by being very decisive about by making decisions even when they don't have the 100% of the information. And that type of personality is often impatient with too much process and often feels like it can leap to the solution. It can skip over the problem definition phase because they already know what to do. And what I've found in my own work, when I do workshops like this with organizations, whether they're public sector or private sector, is that it's often the leaders who create the unproductive dynamics in a workshop setting or in an in-person setting. Because first of all, because of the hierarchy, they speak with greater authority than others in the room. But then secondly, because of what I just described, they have a kind of history, a track record of being rewarded for being very decisive very quickly. But in the process you're talking about, it's kind of delicate, right? In the beginning, you want to solicit a lot of different opinions. You want to hear from everybody in the organization, top, bottom, side, out in the periphery, and so forth, because you might find new information there. And sometimes those executive leaders are impatient with that process. So tell me a little bit about that. If you've had an experience like that, how have you managed through that?
That's a really great question because you are
Thanks.
right.
That's what we do here.
Sometimes leaders need to make decisions,
Yep.
immediately in the short term with very little information, and that's true. And but foresight is not foresight is a longer process. And so usually when an organization wants to engage in this type of thinking, the leadership is supporting more of a longer term process. So they
So you get an
understand,
agreement up front with them. You say,
yes,
no, it's going to work, and here's what you got to do, and you got to restrain the impulse and let the other people talk.
yeah, well, they understand that this is going to be probably at minimum a 6 month type of engagement process, right? And you'll have different types of activities that gradually build on each other to advance insights for action. So you're right. So, and you want to set the tone right from the beginning. So I work with my clients and I help them build the internal, capabilities to kind of manage those dynamics, within the organization. So it's setting the foundations of this is what this workshop is about, the expectations.
Mhm.
This is how we have to flatten the power structures. So we want to hear from everyone. We want to engage maybe external stakeholders and get their perspective and input. So you're setting the foundation up front. And if you are having challenges with that, it does compromise the ability to do good foresight work
Yeah, for sure.
because you
No, I
have
get that.
someone
I get
dominant. Yeah.
that. Basically, they're not going to get what they paid for if they interrupt and dominate the session. Uh,
Oh, and people
Sometimes.
feel safe to express, right? If they disagree for fear of being judged or fear that it might impact their job.
Now, there are probably people who are not in the room when you're doing that kind of work. So how do you solicit their input? How do you make sure that the views of the people out in the field or in the periphery, how do they get their views represented in the session?
Yeah, it's a good question. So typically, before you get into a strategic conversation series where you're doing all kinds of activities, including scenarios, there's an upfront piece, as I mentioned, around understanding the landscape. And sometimes, as part of that, it's not just scanning for information and looking at trends and emerging issues, but we are also interviewing experts. And so you'll probably want to be very clear about who the experts are, that you really want some deeper knowledge and perspective and insights. And it's not just experts that can tell you the trends. You want experts that are in that system, that know that world really well, and they can tell you what's changing.
Hmm.
What are things that are emerging? What are some of those weak signals of change, that we can see that are happening? We don't know how they're going to evolve, but we know it's a shift. What are those emerging issues? How can things potentially escalate? So you really want to get at those experts and you want to get different perspectives. So you can do that through interviews and
Hmm.
then bring those insights into a strategic conversation series and have a variety of different stakeholders work with that knowledge.
Now, here in the United States, and actually around the world, this is the year of elections, right? So half the population of the planet voted in a national election this year. We've seen a wave of resistance against, I guess, opposition to the ruling party. Whatever party was in power in almost every country in the world has either lost share of voters or they've actually been turned out of office. So it's not just a phenomenon that happened in the US recently, but it's actually happened around the world this year. So there's a sort of rising tide of people are pushing back. Some of that's economic. People are pushing back against inflation and prices, and they're just punishing whichever party's in office. But there's a second trend, and I think it's relevant to what you just said. The second trend is that there's also a rising tide of resistance to top-down hierarchy and so-called experts. The idea that, we're going to let the experts make the decision or make the recommendation, and the bureaucracy is going to defer to outside experts. What we start to see is these populist movements, and they're all over the world. Populist movements reject that expert idea. Now, that's not always great because sometimes those populist movements unleash anarchy. They don't know, and people rebel against it. What I'm thinking about right now, as I say that as an example for our listeners, is during the pandemic, around the world, we saw resistance to wearing a mask. A mask was a simple precaution. The main benefit of the mask was that you didn't sneeze on somebody else or cough on somebody else. So it minimized the amount of, um, spreading of the disease that way. It would not save you, of course, from getting an infection. That's true. But around the world, we saw people resist that, even though experts around the world are like, look, this is a simple precaution that everyone can take. And if we all do it, it'll help a little bit. People resisted it. They also resisted taking the vaccine. And there were all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories about vaccines, people who had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. People with no understanding of infectious disease and no understanding of vaccines were making wild claims like the vaccine contains a microchip that's going to somehow track you or something. These are people who don't understand radio technology. They don't understand what microchips are or how you do a power supply for electronics. They were
Right.
literally just spouting nonsense. But these ideas gained a great deal of traction. And I think that's one of the problems that we have today in media. The democratization of media tools has made it possible for people with crackpot ideas to spread those ideas around the world very quickly. And now the crazy people can find each other. All the crazy people who believe that stuff can find each other and connect. And so you start to see that that emerges as a voice, that emerges as
Absolutely.
a point of view, right? And our tendency, people like you and me, our tendency is to try to gather all views, right? We want to make sure everybody's represented because we think it's important to include all the perspectives. That's how you get buy-in. That's how you build consensus. But when you invite the views of crackpot populists who have no fundamental understanding of the dynamics at work here, no history, no expertise, you're actually inviting chaos into the room because you have a group of people that aren't going to respect the knowledge or wisdom, the many years of expertise that are represented in the room. How do you handle that phenomenon? By the way, this is something I struggle with in my own work. This is a constant challenge wherever I work in the world. So go ahead, talk about that one. I know I'm throwing you curveballs here today, but it's kind of a fun conversation for me to
That
talk.
is a wild curveball, but it's a really important question because you're right. Like when you're right, you can't ignore this when you're doing foresight work because a lot of times when we're looking at scanning, we're not just looking at like the geopolitics or the emergencies or the economics or the tech. Because a lot of times people focus on technology and all of that, and that's important, but you have to look at the social dimensions of it, what's happening in the culture and how they're responding to the shifts happening geopolitically or economically and the rate of change that's happening and the pressure it's putting on people. And so, how we look at it within a foresight project is that we look at what's happening from a social dynamic perspective. Where are things escalating? Where are there potential for conflicts or where are the conflicts happening? And trying to understand that pattern within the system. What's driving that? Because that's also very much deeply in systems thinking. So I do a lot of combination of systems analysis with anticipatory thinking and futures. So when I look at that kind of social dynamic, it's important to see what is that loop, that vicious feedback loop that's happening there, what's driving it, and is there something that we can do to slow down the speed of growth, or can we do something to balance it out? So it actually, by understanding and going deeper into that dynamic, you can start to ask very interesting questions about the system
Mhm.
and which way it's going, how to balance it. And if it were to really be disruptive, what does that mean
Mm.
for the organization, the system? What are those cascading consequences?
It seems to me that that's a necessary step just for acceptance alone. In other words, you might develop a great strategy. You might develop a series of tactics that will get you to achieve that strategy, that'll get you to the right place. But all that strategy and tactics is meaningless if you can't get the population to go along with you. And I think this is one of the places where our bureaucrats tend to fail. They're a little tone deaf when it comes to talking to people. Of course, politicians are not tone deaf. They understand it. And if the populace is, resistant to it, they're going to adopt that very quickly. And then that puts great pressure on the bureaucrats. And I see that, at least in this country, I see that quite frequently, where you've got a disconnect between what we call inside the beltway, the people that run the national government, that staff the national government, and then the politicians who represent all the folks in the rest of the country. Sometimes those politicians are echoing the populist perspectives. And I think it's very difficult, very, 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 very difficult for a bureaucrat who's used to being listened to by virtue of the fact that they've done the job for a long time, they know the subject matter, and they have some degree of expertise, but they may lack the charisma to communicate that message in a way that it'll be accepted by a large number of people. So that's a failure of leadership. And so in some respects, I think what you're working on and the kind of work you do, it's not just about helping develop the muscle of foresight and planning and strategic thinking. There's another set of muscles you're developing, which are communication tools and leadership ability. How does strategy and planning dovetail with leadership? How should our leaders approach the subject of strategy?
It's a good question. So
Thanks. I
when
love
you're
it.
looking at
Questions. I
strategy,
mean, that's what we do on this show is
you do.
ask
Yeah,
questions.
I have to think about this one, but you have to think about the environment we're in right now. We're in a very, volatile type of environment. There's a lot of changes happening everywhere. It's very complex. There's a lot of uncertainty, and it's creating a lot of discomfort for people, a lot of anxiety and fear. So leaders need to understand this, and they need to, when they're putting together their strategies, first of all, they need to understand and to reflect on whether their strategies are are they reflective of the needs of those that they're serving. For example, there's an empathy element to this in terms of understanding the needs of different people, perspectives, maybe populations, and what they fundamentally need. So seeing it through as best as you can, kind of seeing it through their lens, how they might see things, perceive things, what they need to feel secure, to feel like there's a future, to feel hope. You need to kind of look at it from their perspective, especially when you're cultivating and you're designing whatever strategy, but also in the communication of it. How are you connecting with people? How are you resonating with things that
Yeah.
matter to them? This is very important,
No,
right?
you're absolutely right. Look, during the pandemic, I dealt with a group here in California, local business leaders, and we had a complete shutdown of business. And it was killing small businesses. They couldn't afford to keep paying their rent and so on. And I talked to Kathleen Ferrara, who was the head epidemiologist for the county of Los Angeles, which represents millions of people. It's a very big area here in California. Um, and I said, look, what the business leaders want to know is what measures can we take to stay open? What can we do to keep our doors open? Can you give some guidance on that? It can't just be a blanket like close the store because the economy is going to collapse if you continue doing that. And she said, it's not my responsibility to tell them what to do to manage the business. I'm not responsible for the economic well-being. I'm responsible for the public health. And I'm telling you right now, we're going to keep the place closed. I was really stunned at the complete lack of empathy and complete lack of understanding and the unwillingness to even contemplate those perspectives from the people who pay her salary. I was really stunned by that. And of course, it gave me great insight into the massive level of resentment towards the state government here, where I'm a huge believer in public safety. And of course, I comply with all those recommendations because I don't want to get sick. Like to me, it makes perfect sense to do those things. But I understood suddenly, I was like, oh, wow, this is a government that has a disconnect with the population, right? The regular citizens here, they have a need. It's not being heard. They're being told to do something that, inherently doesn't make sense and doesn't feel right to them. And no one's making a good explanation. No one's attempting to like explain why that's going to serve them better or how they're going to come out with a better outcome. Okay,
Yeah.
listen,
What you
it's time
said
for me
was
to.
really important. Oh,
Okay,
I just
go
want
ahead.
to
No,
add
go ahead. If that's
to
important,
that.
I want to hear all about it. Go
Oh,
for it.
it's so important. Because what you're saying here is that kind of behavior of not actually thinking from the perspective of, those that are being impacted by what policies or, that are or strategies that are being implemented. What's happening is people are having a distrust in the
Yeah,
system, you
that's
know,
right.
and so they don't feel confident, they don't feel heard, they don't feel valued, and they're disconnecting and they
Yeah.
just don't want to listen.
I think
And so this
that's
is
the
very
reason for
important.
this global phenomenon
That's
populism.
important.
People are like, I don't trust the government. I don't
Absolutely.
trust the experts and so on. Okay, let me do this
Yeah.
before we go to a break. What we love to do is get to know our guests a little bit more. And so we ask a series of short questions. So these can be like a one word answer, a very short answer, one sentence answer. I'm going to ask you a few questions about how you came to think about the future. And so this is the lightning round.
Okay.
Here we go. The first question in the lightning round for Donna Dupont. Tell me about a futurist who has impressed you or shaped your perspective about the future. Someone who's inspired you.
Wow, this is going to be hard because I studied futures thinking, and I've studied a lot of different methodologies. So, someone who's shaped my perspective of the future. I would have to say that it would be Alvin Toffler,
Oh, great.
author of Future Shock.
Yeah, great. Still
I
relevant today.
So relevant. I was rereading that book a couple
Me too.
years ago, and
Yeah.
I was like, yes,
Yes.
yes, like this is actually what's happening today, the
Yeah.
accelerations and the, questioning whether people can adapt to the change and what
Yeah.
happens if we have to adapt too quickly. What does that do to a society,
Yeah. It's really
and
relevant. If people
very relevant.
haven't listened to Future Shock or haven't read Future Shock, the book's 50 years old, but it's such a worthwhile read. He was on the
It,
he saw the long-term trends. Okay, next
absolutely.
question. What was your first experience or exposure to science fiction? What's the first science fiction show or book or story that you read?
Yeah. I would say the first book, science fiction book that really resonated with me, where I really felt something, was the Canticle for Leibowitz.
Oh, great.
It's a
Wow.
really old book, but I remember reading it when I was like 12, and I remember just being so, I was just so immersed in the story of,
Mhm.
of this. It was very dystopian, very dark, but
Yeah.
there was this, beam of light towards the future and hope and trying to navigate, for some meaning and truth in the world. And I think that just really inspired me.
Yeah, the grocery list from the past that created a whole
Yes.
kind of like, belief system and as people are trying to rebuild the future. Wow, great fun. Okay, folks, we're listening to Donna Dupont. She's an expert in foresight and strategic thinking, and we are going to come back in a moment after this break to talk about some of the implications of some of the decisions that are being made right now for the future. You're listening to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek. We'll be back in just a minute. Okay, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tercek. This week I'm flying solo without Brett King because he's over in the Middle East again, barnstorming around the world, teaching people about the future. My guest is Donna Dupont, and Donna is an expert in helping organizations develop and cultivate a better understanding of the future. And since that's what we like to do in this show, she's the perfect guest for the show. Donna, as we were talking about your broad expertise in the public sector, in the military and defense, crime fighting, even in mining and other complex operations, what was on my mind the whole time is this one question I want to hit you with now, which is this. What should we be worried about? What are the impending crises of the future that we should all be concerned about?
So these days, where a lot of my attention is focused is on climate security.
Hmm.
So climate change and security, because it really applies to everyone. We're all living, in this environment, and there's a lot of changes happening in the environment. And a lot of times we're not necessarily paying attention because sometimes that information is so scientific, it's hard to apply in terms of what it means to my day-to-day life. But we are seeing a lot of changes happening at the global level, and it's being manifested as emergencies or disasters,
Right,
right? And so we're
right.
seeing an increase of that around the world. And that's very concerning because that will create a lot of additional vulnerability within the system if people are not able to cope
Yeah.
with these types of response to emergencies or recover
Yeah,
or if
we have a good example
disrupt.
of that right now in the US. We have
Absolutely.
the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which has depleted its budget for responding to climate emergencies, particularly extreme weather emergencies. We just saw that happen with the series of huge hurricanes that hit the Southeast. Unprecedented levels of damage. I think Brett quoted a figure of $130 billion of damage that's been incurred. So that's completely overwhelming for that
Absolutely.
agency. And I guess the point there is simple. If we continue to heat up the climate and continue to pump out carbon into the atmosphere, we're going to get more of that extreme weather, not less. So we seem to be doing exactly the wrong behavior if we want to mitigate that crisis. What should we be doing?
So, well, first of all, I think that it's really important to have a lot more awareness of what's happening within the environment. So, and that means for people too at the local level, because as you said, the environment's changing, and the likelihood of a lot more extreme weather events is pretty plausible, right? That we're going to see that. It's going to look different in different parts of the world, depending on where you live. If you're near a coastline, or if you're, in another part of the country or another part of the world. So it really depends on, but I think what we need to be doing as citizens, is looking at what this means in terms of where I live. So how do I protect my home at a personal level? How do I stay safe in my community? And thinking about building internal or resilience at the personal, community, and then in your organizational level too. Because organizations need to think about how is this changing climate affecting, my day-to-day business, right?
Sure,
The
sure, but
ability to
hang on.
do
Let me help
work,
me understand. Help me
services.
understand something. I'm sorry. So I'm sorry to crash in, but when you say that, I'm
Sure.
thinking of our audience right now, and there's somebody who's listening who's thinking, well, what can I do to stop climate change? What can I do? I mean, perhaps they're listening in their car as they drive to work, right? So, they can pack an emergency kit, I suppose, in case there's an earthquake or a gigantic storm, right? So you can take that precaution. Make sure you have provisions to protect your family and feed your family at your
Right.
home. But what can an individual do to prevent a wildfire or to prevent a flood? Is there anything they can realistically do? I think there's a sense of helplessness there, right? We're told to be prepared, we're told to be resilient, but what is the actual thing that we can do?
Well, when you talk about prevention of an actual wildfire or prevention of a flood, I think for the individual, that's usually not their role is to prevent the actual hazard. And sometimes we can't prevent the hazard. Like it's the conditions within the environment, especially
Mhm.
with wildfires. Like it has a lot to do with, temperature, heat, um, you know, dryness,
Yeah.
wind conditions. There's a lot of factors. In fact, they have like fire behaviorists that try to understand the environment and predict what will happen. But I think as individual citizens, it's really important that we plug in to our local emergency management communities at the local level to understand what we can do or what are the risks to the community and how we can make sure we're safe and
We as
make
a group, you mean
that
we as a community?
as a community. So individuals and communities feel safe. And
All right, so one
organizations,
thing that might translate to is cooperating with local authorities when they give you
absolutely.
instructions on how to respond instead of being defiant.
That's right.
Um, all right, I mean, I get
That is
that, but
one thing. So connecting in and really making sure that you're getting information from a credible source. Because what we've noticed with emergencies, now there's a lot of mis and disinformation,
yeah, that's
flooding, and
true.
that will just take off, right? And because it's the nature of sometimes how it's framed can be really enticing for it to spiral, across the web. So it's really
Okay, so
important
there the
that you're
advice
getting
is think
information.
twice before you click on that link and think twice before you
Absolutely.
share that wild rumor to your friends on
Absolutely.
social.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. So think twice. Where is that information coming from? You don't want to spread misinformation. So think twice, make sure you're getting good information from a credible source and being able to take proactive action. Because as you were saying before, with some of the examples that we're seeing with a lot of emergency services, a lot of times when there is an emergency, their resources become maxed out very quickly.
Yeah,
And they're
yeah,
having to ask for support from military operations
yeah,
and other different services. So that pattern probably won't change. In fact, it might even create more strain
yeah.
on emergency services, which means that as individuals and citizens in society, we need to think about our own safety a little bit and safety of those around us.
I hear what you're saying. Although what's crossing my mind as I'm listening to you, though, is again, I put myself in the shoes of the person at home who may live in a fire zone or flood zone, right? Many of us do. Uh, they can't move to another house, right? That's not a practical suggestion. They're where they are. They're not going to move. So they have to kind of deal with what they've got. And the advice is, be prepared for an emergency, right? And I think you're right. It's not a good habit of mine to expect someone to rescue you because when there's an emergency, you're probably going to be on your own for at least a few days. And it does make sense to have a certain amount of cash and fresh water and some food supplies, and probably an emergency blanket or something. I think everybody
Absolutely.
probably should if they live in one of those regions, whether it's
Absolutely.
fire, earthquake, flood, tornado, you name it, be prepared. But then again, what we tend to see is the first thing that goes is your house, right? When there's one of these big emergencies, whether it's, the hundreds of houses that just get burned down in Ventura County in California, or the houses that were washed away in the floods in North Carolina recently. In that tragic situation, okay, I did the thing I was supposed to do. I had my emergency prepared kit. I had some cash available and a sturdy pair of boots, and they were all there ready with my go bag. And then my house burned down, or my house got washed away in a flood. Now what?
Now what? Well, you're going to be evacuating, right? So this is where you want to really make sure that you have a plan in place about if you were asked to evacuate, do you have a place to go?
Hmm.
Where would you go? How would you get there? Do you have a car to drive there? Do you have gas in your car to get you there? When should you leave so that you don't get stuck in traffic? Like these are all like logistical
Hmm.
pieces, but these are important to think about. Like, do you
Absolutely.
have a place to go? And if you don't, a lot of states, provinces, like a lot of times when there is an emergency, you're going to have some sort of reception centers or evacuation centers open for those that may not have anywhere to go. But you want to ideally set something up if you can. Not everyone
Yeah.
has that ability.
I think that's really good advice. One thing we can be sure of is an emergency of some sort is going to occur in your lifetime, and that's not the moment when you want to try to figure out where the nearest hospital or police station is. You probably want to be familiar with those things in advance. And so
Absolutely.
here, everybody listening can take a little bit of advice from Donna, where she's focused on helping organizations, big national organizations, prepare for emergencies. There is some advice you can take from her, which is to do that same kind of scenario planning in your own household.
Yeah.
What is the worst case scenario? What should we be prepared for? Do we live in a zone where fire is more likely to happen, or a tornado, or a hurricane, or some other kind of disaster? And what steps should we take in that situation? And what if we are turned out of our house? What should we do then? And where would I go in that situation? Who would I contact? Do I have their number handy? I know this sounds a little dire, but candidly, we
Yeah.
keep getting the same lesson again and again and again. Every year this decade has been hotter than the previous year. Every year the wildfires come back. Every year the hurricane season, they say it's a record hurricane season. So I guess Mother Nature is going to keep giving us this lesson until we learn how to prepare for it. So, folks, you can do some emergency planning on your own. You can do scenario planning in your own household or with your own family. Is there any other
That's right.
advice you would give, or should we maybe shift the gears to talk a little bit more broadly about what you're seeing organizations do at the national level to mitigate these risks? So
Yeah.
not just about responding to the emergency, but more about proactive planning to be prepared for them, or even minimize the chance of an emergency. What positive things are you seeing national agencies do?
So when we shift gears toward from like more individual, right, which I loved your idea around scenarios and really thinking about some even not, doesn't have to be, worst case. It can be even what's plausible. What do you see
Yeah.
changing in your environment? What's plausible that it's realistic that you might have to actually evacuate because there could be a flood, and so don't always think worst case, but what's happening around your community, what's happening in surrounding areas, and how should you be taking proactive action to protect yourself and your family and your community. At a national level, it's my work has been around more risk, threats, and security, and looking at it in a much more broader context. So not necessarily specifically emergency hazards, although climate change, right, and a lot of the environmental patterns affect every organization. So a lot of what I'm seeing is this interest in understanding what that looks like and how it's going to impact the organization. So one example would be when you have a lot of, I'm trying to think of actually a very specific example to help, because sometimes the more specific ones from the private sector
Mhm.
help a little bit more because they have concrete outputs, right? So, for example, specific to climate change, a lot of organizations, especially private sector, have been very interested in doing risk assessments to understand the
Mhm.
climate impact to their operations, so their critical infrastructure, how this can affect operations, their staff, supply chains. So they're looking at it from that lens of what do we know from the past? What's changing? What have we learned in terms of vulnerabilities in the system? And what can we do proactively to address those vulnerabilities moving into the future? And so that's the type of work that we've been being asked to do a lot of from a
Sure.
climate lens. Yeah.
Give us a for instance. Can you get a little more specific? Because the generalities, I get those, but I think people
Hmm.
listening would be like, okay, so tell me about one organization and what were the specific recommendations?
Specific recommendations?
Yeah.
Well, that's a tricky one because from a climate perspective, there are so many different moving parts. So, a lot of the climate security work that I've been doing to date has been around understanding the landscape and how to bring people together around collaboration. Because what's happening right now, before we can get into decisions and in next steps, the system is very siloed, right? So you have a lot of different stakeholders working in different levels of the system that are not coordinated or collaborating on this front together. So what we need is a lot more collaboration and coordination around, climate change and security. And there's a lot of consequences around what does it look like for displacement. So that impacts not just governments, right, in terms of displacement of people, but also agencies that work in humanitarian sector, international development. They're actively involved in understanding displacement and
Mhm.
what that means in terms of how they support people, right, to keep them safe, keep them housed. So those are really big pieces. And then there are others that are working in the climate space that look at food security and how is climate impacting our food systems, right? And our ability to grow food and to have what we need, right? And how do we build a more resilient agricultural system? There's also those that are working with water and the water cycle and to understand what water, impact to water regarding which impacts agriculture. So is conditions of drought, conditions of flooding, how do we understand the water cycle? Then there's
Mhm.
energy, right? So there's so many different pieces to this. So right now, from a climate security perspective, there's a lot of conversation happening about how to bring different parts of the system together and stakeholders to collaborate.
Mhm.
It's unprecedented how the level of collaboration we need around this, but we're also need to collaborate in an environment where there's a lot of competition happening and geopolitical shifts happening. And so now we're having this tension. And so this is where we're at, right? And I was very lucky to attend the Montreal Climate Security Summit just a couple weeks ago, where it really brought in people from all around the world to talk about, over the of course of a few days, to talk about all of these different dimensions of climate security, and each one of them having significant implications for civilians and, just human security overall, and how we can work together, to understand and to really address this type of threat.
Wow. The That sounds like great progress to me because what you're describing isn't just government to government communication, but agency to agency and then cross agencies. I can imagine that's quite a lot to coordinate, and I can also imagine that takes a lot of time and effort to get that coordination to occur.
It takes a lot of time. And so it's not something that I'm coordinating on my own,
No,
but
of
I'm
course not.
part
Yeah.
of a network. And we're very fortunate here in Canada. We have the newly launched NATO Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence, and that's their role at a global scale to
This is the
help.
North American Treaty
Right.
Organization, has a North
It,
Atlantic Treaty Organization. So
that's right.
the
Yeah.
that's a national defense organization, and they're focused on climate.
They are. Yeah, climate change and security. They do have a security lens to it, but they also recognize that there are so many stakeholders in this particular space and that they need to collaborate with those that are in international development and the science and to be able to, because it's a continuum. It really is like,
Hmm.
things we look at crisis and emergencies, but if we don't address them, they escalate into conflict, which escalates into other forms of extreme conflict, which is war fighting.
That is
And on the
correct.
other side of it is really international development and really looking at the vulnerabilities in the system and trying to build more safe communities, right? And to
Mhm.
really address the needs at a fundamental level. So it's a continuum. And so the whole system needs to coordinate. It's not an easy task at all, but it's such an important piece because there's a lot of work being done in silos right now.
Donna, to close the show, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you think the future holds? Give me a forecast for 5 to 10 years from now. What do you think the major challenges are going to be that society faces, the world faces? And what do you think we'll do to mitigate those risks?
So in futures, we don't tend to forecast. So I'm going to give you some insights in terms of system changes that I think are really important to understand and and the evolution of those changes. So the first would be we just talked about climate. So obviously understanding the environment and what are some of those changes that are happening
Mhm.
currently in the environment and how are those evolving, right, in terms of potential for consequences like extreme weather events, food security, water, energy, things like that. So that's one dimension. The other piece that's really important is to pay attention to the geopolitics and what's happening, right? So understanding what's happening right now, obviously we have, in America, we have Trump, coming in, new presidency. There's going to be a lot of changes happening in terms of,
That's
foreign
putting it
policy,
mildly. Yes.
just putting it mildly, even internally to the US in terms of, just the government structures. There's going to be a lot of changes. And so it's really paying attention.
Mhm.
What are those changes that are happening in the system? So it's a really a big systems lens of understanding the system,
Mhm.
what's changing, what's emerging, and how can things escalate, right?
Mhm.
So, and the other piece is the social dimension, which I think is very important. People. So understanding what's happening now in response to those other two changes. So now you're bringing in three dimensions of change, right? Because that's what we do in futures is we don't look at it in isolation. We look at it as a complex system.
Mhm.
How are they interacting with each other? And what is happening in response to some of these geopolitical shifts, climate shifts, what's happening to people, how are people and populations responding to this? And so if you start to pay attention to these patterns, then you can start to anticipate what could plausibly happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And it's hard to do in terms of we don't do project like I don't do predictions because
So,
the system is so complicated, right? And a lot of times what the future isn't necessarily predetermined. It's based on the decisions we make today.
mhm.
So, this is why understanding and paying attention to the changes that are happening today and what that means. Ask yourself, what does that mean for the future? For me, for my community, for my organization, for my country, you got to ask those questions. You got to pay attention. A lot of us are not paying attention to those changes until it becomes a really big issue. And then all of a sudden we're, paying attention. So you need to look at the subtle shifts.
Great.
That's what a
Good.
futures does.
Thank you for that. Donna Dupont, thanks for being a guest on The Futurist. Tell me, how can people find out more about your work? Where can they find you on the web?
So you can go to my website, purplecompass.ca. And I am in 2025, I'm launching a whole bunch of new initiatives that are free for those that want to build futures literacy,
Oh,
futures
great.
intelligence. And really it's a community of just building the knowledge so that people can use that in their work.
Oh,
And
great. Let us know when you launch that because we'll definitely talk about it here. That's our mission. We want more people to think about the future and we want to help them learn how to do that. Well, thank you very much for joining us on The Futurists. And thanks again to the folks at Provoke Media who make the show possible. And thank you to our engineer, Kevin Hirshorn, who's always making us sound great. I know there were a couple audio glitches on this one. Unfortunately, sometimes we're dependent on the quality of the internet connection. But thanks, folks, for listening through that. Thank you, too, to our listeners for your comments, suggestions, feedback, and advice. We welcome that very much. Next week, Brett and I will be back with another person who is thinking about and shaping the future. And until then, we will see you in the future.